There is one particular conversion that's been requested for a while now, and I've kind of been putting it off. But seeing as the Dark Angels are now getting their 9th edition Codex supplement, I thought it was the perfect time to tackle him. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video I'll be showing you how to build a Primaris version of Azrael, Supreme Grandmaster of the Dark Angels. As a starting point for this conversion, I had a couple of choices, Lazarus and Zachariah. Both are Primaris and both wear the robes synonymous with the Dark Angels. Ultimately, I settled on Lazarus. Being a master rather than a lieutenant, he comes with a few extra details about his person, and the kit also contains additional components to help pad out my bits box. With the kit chosen, I began to remove all the components required to build the torso and the legs of the miniature, before cleaning up any removing sprue tabs or mold lines. Going into this conversion, I already knew that I wanted to use a different left arm. The Lazarus torso, however, came with a small raised tab over the left shoulder, which normally would help to guide the position of the original arms. To apply a different arm, I needed to remove this. I started with my clippers before shaving the surface flat. Once complete, I then started to assemble the legs to the front of the torso. By making this adjustment before assembly, I avoided the chance of accidentally breaking off the glued-on components. With the legs built, I held off attaching the right armor plate just yet, as another adjustment was needed. In order to make some room for other details, I decided to remove the small pouch that was attached to the side of the plate. I started with clippers to separate the two before tidying up the cut. With this done, the plate could be glued to the thigh. Now, there are a lot of different representations of Azrael. We have this very old model as well as a number of pieces of artwork to draw inspiration from. I ultimately settled on this particular piece. It has been used as the cover for a couple of books and is a really nice grimdark interpretation of Azrael. The first detail that I was to copy from this image was the small shield just below the waist. I took the shield from the Primaris Intercessor kit, but it was just a little too big and wasn't quite the correct shape. To fix both of these problems, I used my clippers to cut horizontally across the top to square out the shield. This was then trimmed and flattened out with a combination of my knife and a flat file. Now, before I could attach the shield, I first needed to make sure I had enough room for it, so I attached the back half of Lazarus' torso. Having already made space for the shield by removing the small pouch, I was then able to glue it into place over the right thigh. Another great reason for using Lazarus as the starting point for this conversion was the fact that he is holding his winged helmet in his right hand, exactly like Azrael is in my reference art. So I began to assemble this arm and helmet as per the instructions, but leaving the shoulder pad separate for now. Instead of using the shoulder that came with the kit, I wanted something a little more ostentatious to represent Azrael's higher rank. Luckily, I had this Aquila emblazoned shoulder pad left over from some Vanguard veterans, which was just what I needed. The problem was that the slightly larger profile of the pad interfered with the carried helmet and so couldn't be properly attached without the need for some tweaks. I used my knife to carefully scrape away the bottom right of the shoulder pad, reducing the width bit by bit. I made a few comparisons during this process to ensure that I wasn't cutting away too much or that I was cutting in completely the wrong place. And once I was finally happy with the fit, I glued the shoulder pad into place. Even though Lazarus already comes with a sword carrying left arm, I wanted the pose to reflect Azrael's artwork, with the sword being held pointed downwards and the pommel being above the hand. Fortunately, the Dark Angels Primaris upgrade has just the arm that I needed. It was perfect as it was and didn't require any extra adjustments beyond the trim to the shoulder joint that I had already made earlier. I assembled this together and attached the Lazarus left shoulder pad to it as well. For both the right and left arms, I didn't attach them to the torso just yet. As there is quite a lot going on detail-wise, I thought that it would be better to paint them separately to avoid having to paint those hard-to-reach areas. With the arms built, I could start to work on Azrael's power pack. Now, traditionally, he sports an extremely large banner here, but I wanted something a little more subtle, and wouldn't you know it, my reference art had just the thing. Just behind his head, there are several wooden boards with skulls and parchment attached to them. No doubt, this would hold some spiritual or historical significance, rather than just being some scraps fished out of a dumpster. So to recreate these, I began with one of the boards from the Free Guild Flagellant set. It already had most of the boards that I needed, but would require some cutting to make them fully usable. I began this process with my saw, using it to separate out the planks from each other, and then following this, I then needed to remove the parchment from one side of the planks. I began with the clippers and used these to remove the bulk of the parchment. Anything that couldn't be removed with the clippers was then trimmed away using my knife to flatten out the board. The only problem with the planks at this stage was that one side featured the wood grain and the other side was perfectly flat, so I needed to recreate this wood grain effect myself. With the sharp point of my scalpel, I scoured a series of lines running the length of the plank. I avoided perfectly straight lines and tried to keep them as organic as possible and made a few passes over these scoured lines to help deepen them. This process of clipping, trimming and scouring was then completed across the other two planks too, which left me with these. Now I wanted to attach these to the area just behind the head, but needed something to attach them to and to make sure that I could still attach the power pack. So to solve both of these, I just glued the power pack on first. With this done, I compared the planks against it. I could see that the planks were a little too long as they currently stood and so needed to be clipped to length. I started with the central plank, I used my clippers to reduce its length and roughed up the top edge of the wood to give it a snapped and damaged look. With prep complete, it was glued into place, as were the other two planks which I cut to varying lengths to avoid them looking too uniform. With the planks in place, I could add the skulls that were featured in the artwork. I'm not sure if they're supposed to be trophies of the fallen that Azrael has hunted down or holy relics. Either way, it's a good excuse to say dead animal bits. I grabbed myself a couple of the damaged skulls from the Citadel skull set, one with and one without a jaw. I made a few trims to the underside of the skulls to allow them to sit more comfortably atop the planks before gluing them into place. Next, I needed some strips of parchment. Normally I turn to other kits for these, but I thought I'd try a little bit of sculpting with some green stuff. I cut away some of the blue and yellow halves but left the points where they touched alone. This contact point can sometimes have already cured, which can result in your green stuff being lumpy or gritty when you start to mix it, so it's best to leave it alone. Once mixed, I wanted to flatten out the green stuff into a large flat piece of only around 0.5 millimeter in thickness. To avoid the green stuff from sticking to my cutting mat or to my rollers, I applied 2 sheets of baking paper. I sandwiched the green stuff between the two pieces, but it's advisable to add a little Vaseline or water to these to prevent the paper from sticking them too. Then, with my rolling pin, I proceeded to flatten out the green stuff to the desired thickness. Once done, I removed the green stuff and allowed it to partly cure for around 30 minutes. This will slightly harden the mix and make it easy to work with in the next step. Now that the green stuff had been given a chance to cure, I could begin to cut it. I used my knife to cut rectangular strips of around 2 millimeters in width. Again, I'd recommend using water or Vaseline at this point to prevent the putty from sticking to your tools or your surface. I cut away a shorter piece first and used my knife to add some nicks and tears before attaching the strip of parchment to the central plank that I added earlier. While my mixed green stuff was still workable, I followed the exact same steps as before to create some long strips of parchment too, which were attached to Azrael's belt. With the green stuff on the main torso being left to cure, I could start to work on Azrael's combi plasma. Here I made the decision to not recreate the bullpup design of the classic Azrael model. It didn't really make sense from a mechanical point of view, and I felt that I wasn't really losing anything by sticking to a more traditional combi plasma design. So to build this weapon, I started with the bolter from the Lazarus kit and carefully removed the strap from it before putting it to one side for use later on. The points where the strap had been removed from were then cleaned up using my knife. Next, I needed to make space for the underslung plasma weapon. First of all, the bolter's barrel would need to sit higher, and so this required me to carefully cut away the bolter's muzzle, keeping this handy for later use as well. Once removed, I then cut away the segmented grip. I used the pre-existing lines as a guide for where my cut should be made. And once removed, I brought in my file and used this to square off and flatten out the edges of those previous trims. To source the plasma half of the combi plasma, I dug out an old Firstborn Devastator plasma pistol, but whatever pistol-sized plasma weapon you have to hand could be used here instead. Whilst it was already small, it needed to be heavily trimmed down in order to fit beneath the bolter. So I started by clipping just behind where the plasma vent started, as well as removing the hand from the pistol. With the cuts made, I smoothed them out before doing the same to the top side of the pistol as well. I need to do a bit of back and forth here to ensure that I was making the cuts in all the correct places and to the correct amounts. When I was happy with how the plasma pistol and bolter were fitting together, I could bring in my glue and make the bond permanent. After this, I grabbed my previously removed muzzle and attached this a little higher at the front of the bolter. Now, as both of my Azrael's hands were otherwise occupied, I needed to attach the combi plasma to his back, gluing it just below the power pack. Whilst I was tempted to explain this gravity-defying position with magnets, I thought I'd put my previously removed strap to good use. I needed to clip the strap into 2 halves and to make a few trims and tweaks to the clips at either end, but it was quite easy to glue the strap in place just behind the pack, creating the appearance of a looped strap. The final step in building Azrael was to choose a suitable head. I of course needed to use a helmetless head, but since his original miniature was created, Azrael seems to have suffered from some male pattern baldness, with most of his recent depictions featuring a chromed dome. So I grabbed this head from the Assault Intercessors kit, which was not only hairless but had a suitably grim expression that would match my source art perfectly. Like the arms, I decided to keep this separate to make painting it easier, and with that, all I was left to do was to base, paint and assemble the model, which left me with this. And here we have the completed Primaris Azrael, Grandmaster of the Dark Angels, painted in the colours of his chapter. It's been a good while since we've seen a new model for this auspicious Dark Angels character, so hopefully this video will give you some ideas on how to include him in your own forces without him looking out of place against your modern Marines. This was the first time that I've so closely followed some artwork in one of these kitbash videos, and it was both challenging and rewarding, so if you have any other ideas for other classic pieces of art that you would like to see me try and emulate in miniature form, then please do let me know, and make sure to like and subscribe this video. And so the final thing to say is a massive thank you to all of my supporters. Whether you support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliate links. Your help is what keeps this channel alive and what allows me to build these interesting and more elaborate conversions for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all of the relevant links. And so until next time, thanks for watching.